Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a troublemaker. I very often am unpleased with the status quo because I think we always have to move ahead. The one thing that we know is that if you don't move ahead, you move backwards. And as Rabbi pointed out, we're under enormous pressures from the society in which we live, and they have their standards and their values, and subtly we can be pulled into influences that are not our own. Very interesting that Sar Sholem of Belz said that there's several kinds of Golusin. There's a Golus of when Jews are in Golus by Goyim. There's a worse Golus when Jews are in Golus by other Jews. And the worst Golus of all is when a Jew is in Golus in himself. A Golus in himself means that the neshama that we have is oppressed and cannot live up to its potential. And we are in Golus, oppressed by ourselves. Tzigger Meir quoted the Chinuch, where he said that a person is influenced by his behavior, that behavior determines emotions. Very often we think the way we feel, that's how we act. And the Chinuch says, no, that's not necessarily so. The way you act determines how you feel. It's very interesting that there's the famous letter of the Ramban to his son, which the Ramban tells us that we should review at least once every week. And the Ramban starts off his letter by telling his son to be very careful with his anger and rage. And by the way, when he's talking about anger, he does not mean feeling anger. You can't help feeling angry. If somebody provokes you, you're going to feel angry. The kas that he's talking about is kol hakoyes, kol hashever kelem v'chamosoi, the way you react and act out your rage. So he starts off by telling his son, be careful with your rage. And if you will be careful with your rage, and you'll control that, that will bring you to anova, to humility, which is the finest of all traits. To me, the question was immediately obvious. If humility is the finest of all traits, why don't you start by telling your son to be humble? Why do you have to go around like this? Yeah. Control your rage, and then you'll get the humility, which is the best of all traits. Start off with humility. The Ramban was too smart for that, because it can't tell a person how to feel. It can't tell me how I'm supposed to feel. You can tell me how I should act. And inasmuch as the Chinuch says that emotions follow our behavior, when the Ramban says, control your rage, that's something you can do. You can behave that way. And once you act properly, that will bring you to good midos, to good character traits. Because you see, my friends, what is most important in our lives as Jews is what? Kashrus, Taras HaMishpocha, Shmiras Shabbos. Of course, without that, that's the ABCs. You can't build a house without bricks, or wood, or whatever substance you're going to use. But the fact is that if all you have is bricks, you have a pile of bricks and you don't have a house. And there's something that you have to do with the bricks to formulate them, to bring them together into a house. And what Ramchal says in Mesilas Yesharim is that the basis of Torah and mitzvahs is midas, character traits. Let me give you a quote. In some way, it's an astonishing quote. The quote from Reb Chaim Vital, who was the successor, the outstanding student of the Arizal. And his question is, why are the Midas not mentioned specifically in the Torah? We have 613 mitzvahs. We learn Midas from the way Avram Avinu behaved, from the way the Shvat. We learn Midas from the narratives of the Torah. But no way does the Torah say, you're not allowed to be a kassen. You're not allowed to go into fly into rage. So Chaim Vital says, Hein hachonos ha'ikrios al tayag mitzvahs b'kinyumim ha'bevitulim. The midas are a basis and a preface to either observing or violating the mitzvahs. And then he goes on to say, I'm not going to quote the whole thing, V'hilfikoch inyan hamidas harois, bad character traits, koshi min haveres asman me'od, are much worse than averes. Uvazeh tovin inyan masham razal, and now you can understand why the Chachomim said, kol hakoyes, that if anybody loses his temper and goes into rage, oived avoid zora mamish, he is an idolater. Shehi ayoisa shekula kechol talya kamitzis. Avoid zora, the worst of all of the averes. If somebody is narcissistic, self-centered, thinks he's better than everyone else, he's someone who denies Hashem. V'timsa, now listen to these words. You have to be more careful about your character, bad character traits. Right? Min kiyum ha-mitzvahs haseh v'lo yisaseh. You have to be more careful about your character traits than about mitzvahs and averes. Ki b'yoseh bal midas tovos, if you will have good character traits, b'nekel yikayim kol ha-mitzvahs, then you will be able to fulfill all the mitzvahs. Is it possible that you hear someone said, oh, that person is a fine Talmid Chacham, a gewaldiker Yireh Shamayim, but he's a kassen, he's a bad temper. Reb Chaim Vital says that's impossible. He can put on 2 pairs of tefillin in the morning and go to mikveh every morning, and if he's a kassen, he's a shegitz. And worse, bad character traits are worse than averes. You know, my friends, we're living in a dangerous period of time. I don't know that's ever happened like this. Now, I want to tell you a Musa Shemulis that I had. It was a very strange place. Unfortunately, where I grew up, there was no day school. And so I had a melamed after school, but I was exposed to public school. Baruch Hashem, today, we can send our children to day schools. We can send our children to yeshivas. I did not have that privilege. So one story was told about a Greek traveler, a Greek hero, Ulysses. And Ulysses heard that there was a place, a harbor, where there was the music of the Sirens, whatever that meant. But this music was so attractive, it was so irresistible, that anybody who went in that harbor was drawn toward the shore and couldn't resist it. But there were very sharp reefs there, And so the ships that were attracted were destroyed. And ships that went by that harbor and they saw the wreckages of all the ships that were there, but when they heard the music, they had no choice, and they had to follow it. Now, Ulysses wanted to hear the music of the Sirens. But he was smart enough to know that he didn't want to lose his life in the process. So what he did is he stuffed his sailors' ears with wax, so they would not be able to hear the music. And he had himself tied with strong ropes to the mast. And he told his sailors, no matter what you see me do or you hear me do, don't pay any attention. You keep on rowing straight. And so they rowed past the harbor, and the sailors could not hear the music of the Sirens, kept on rowing. And Ulysses, who heard the music of the Sirens, started screaming, head toward shore, head toward shore. And the sailors kept moving, they couldn't hear him. And he struggled against the ropes. I'm your captain. You have to follow my orders. Head toward shore. And they couldn't hear him, they went down. And later on, after they passed the dangerous area, he recognized how close he had been to disaster. And it was only because he was tied to the ropes, tied with ropes, that that saved his life. We're living in a world where the music of the Sirens is everywhere. And it's attracting people to disaster, particularly our youngsters. And the music of the Sirens is powerful. By the way, 100 years ago, Rabbi Yerucham wrote an essay, Ha'oretz nitno biyad rosha, quoting Eov. And he said that the world has been given over to the power of the Sultan. And he shows absolute proof. When Moshe Rabbeinu did not return after 40 days, the Sultan showed them Moshe Rabbeinu mes. He showed them a vision, they saw it with their own eyes. They saw the body of Moshe Rabbeinu being carried to burial. Can't deny your own eyes. How did that happen? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Sultan power to delude and to make us hallucinate. We have no way of knowing if what we see is true or not. It may be hallucination. What we believe and what we are told may be a delusion. And that's the kind of power that the Sultan had. And that was 100 years ago when there was no internet. And today it is 1,000 times worse. The Sultan has taken over and deluded and caused us hallucinations. And we have only one way to defend ourselves. We have to tie ourselves with ropes to Torah. And when we tie ourselves with ropes to Torah, it's not only the mitzvahs hasei, the mitzvahs lois hasei, as Reb Chaim Vital says, but it's the midas of Torah. Now I can't reach everybody, but I can reach you. I want us to all have on the table several sforim that we regularly learn and that we regularly talk with our family about and talk with our children about. Mesilas Yesharim, Orches Tzadikim, Milas Hamidus, and at the Shabbos table or any other time that we have an opportunity to learn and talk about Midas. But learning and talking about Midas isn't enough. We have to act Midas. We have to be careful that we don't go into chaos, that we don't lose our temper, Of course things can happen that provoke us. You come home after a day of work and everything is tired and the house is upside down, and then somebody says something that really provokes you. Yeah. But there you have to be Charlotte and not allow yourself to go into a rage. And you have to be careful about humility, and you have to be careful about envy, and you have to be careful about sticking to the truth, absolutely to the truth. If our children see us lying, right, we've lost them. If our children see us having bad midas, I might tell you that I have worked with youngsters who have gone off the derech, and so many of them have said that the reason they went off the derech was that they saw Yiddishkeit as being ritual only, but missing the substance of midas. And if we want our children to grow up to be true Shemre Torah mitzvahs, then we have to show midas in our own lives. Someone asked me, I wrote a book about spouse abuse. Is it possible for a Frum person to be an abuser of his wife? I said, impossible. Can't be. But I know that it's happened. I said, he's not a Frum person. It's no difference to me as to whether he violates Torah by going into McDonald's and eating a cheeseburger, or whether he violates Torah by being discourteous and abusive to his wife. Listen to a statement of Rabbi Chaim Vital. A person has done wonderful acts of chesed. I mean, he runs around doing wonderful things. Doing all kinds of tzedakahs. And now he's going to come up after 120 years to Gan Eden. And he knows that he's going to give him a wonderful place in Gan Eden. Let him know for certain that the Bezin Shalmaila in heaven will investigate how did he behave toward his wife. If he behaved with chesed, with kindness toward his wife, fortunate, he's going to have a tremendous Gan Eden. Right? But if he irritated his wife, he used to be irritable and angry at home and shout. And used to be overly irritable. Without chesed and without helping in the house. This is going to determine his sentence. And all the chesed that he did for 80 years with others will not even be mentioned. Can you imagine that? If this person who had done chesed had unfortunately one time couldn't resist, he was very hungry, and he went in and he ate treves. Terrible thing. They will punish him in Gehenna for the treves, but they will not take away his mitzvahs of his chesed. But on the other hand, right, if he was emotionally and verbally abusive to his wife, I'm not talking about physically abusive, but if he was abusive to his wife, all his chesed will not even be mentioned. 80 years of chesed going down the drain. You see, my friends, this is why midas is important. The name of the game is midas. Now, obviously, a person who chas v'sholem chal Shabbos, or doesn't observe kashrus or taras hamishpocha, there's no way that he can be ashamed. I mean, that's living an animal life. But by the same token, let us not forget what the Ramban says in Parashat Kedoshim. And the Ramban says that so beautifully. The Ramban says the mitzvah of Kedoshim means over and above keeping the 613 mitzvahs. Because the Ramban says it's possible for a person to keep 613 mitzvahs and be novel b'shus ha-Torah. He can be a vulgar person with a hechsher of the Torah. He's doing everything right. And the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu is a mitzvah esa deraisa, just like putting on tefillin or tzitzis or mezuzah or anything else. So you see, my friends, we're living, Meir talked about, we're living in a culture that has such false standards. I recently wrote a book called Without a Job, Who Am I? And as Rabbi pointed out, our culture has said you are what you do. Your job defines who you are. And so if you don't have a job, so who am I? You're laid off from work, I'm a nothing. No way. The job is a way to earn a living. It doesn't say who you are. Then what does say who I am? What does say who I am is how do I behave and how do I act. And how I act, that is how I will get to feel. Now you say, well, how can you tell somebody how to feel? Well, the Gemara has a problem with that. You should love Hashem. You can tell me I have to feel love. How can I be told what I have to feel? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what it means. Means act in a way that people will love Hashem by observing your behavior. How? Speak decently. Speak pleasantly. Transact honestly. Let people see what it means to be a Shem Torah mitzvahs. And when they will see that kind of behavior from you, right, then they will get to love Hashem, and that's ve'ahavta, making Hashem beloved. We're living in a world, the social world, the corporate world, which has so lost midas, very little left. Very little left. Everything is only for gratification of one's animal desires. And in this culture, we have to raise our children. And yes, we can send them to fine yeshivas and to fine girls' schools, and the yeshiva and the schools will hopefully do the best they can with their limited resources, but it has to begin at home. It has to begin with our own midas. And the mitzvah Hashem, by observing the midas, and now to say, these Frum should now not leave the table. Sforim of midas. I mentioned several. I mentioned Mesilas Yesharim, in Malas Hamidas, in Orchos Tzadikim, and the Sforim of Rav Dessler, and the Sforim of Rav Shlomo Walbam, the Sifrei Musa, Sifrei Chassidus that talk about midas. Clearly we have to have Shulchan Aruch. Without that, it doesn't begin. But we have to put the emphasis on midas for ourselves and for our children. Thank you for listening.